Welcome to this video based on the webinar about understanding dynamic climbing ropes. My name is Stefan van der Leden. I'll be narrating this video, which is based on a webinar that I ran during the first lockdown in 2020 to do something with climbing, sharing knowledge and information with the climbing community on Curacao. So why this webinar? Well, when climbing on Curacao, I've ran a couple of times into situations where people ask me, is it simply a strong rope that you should have to climb with? And I understand the thinking behind that, but the answer to this question is no, a strong rope itself is not enough. You also have to have a climbing rope, a dynamic climbing rope, which has been specifically constructed for that use. This is very important to climb safely and to avoid accidents from happening. So in rock climbing, dynamic climbing ropes, they have a vital role when it comes to safety, and understanding the difference between static and dynamic climbing equipment is a prerequisite for correct application. And incorrect application of climbing equipment can lead to serious injury or death, so that's why it's important to have a look at this. A couple of things about the scope of this webinar. This webinar itself is not a substitute for formal climbing instruction or training. It can be used in a supporting situation, however, and that's probably also the context in which you are viewing this. And this webinar is just about knowledge. That is also important to understand. Things like, for example, constructing an anchor with which is equalized is something which has a knowledge component, but you also need to practice it and under supervision of somebody who can give you feedback whether you're doing it correct, yes or no. And this is of course not something I can do or accomplish within a webinar. Last but not least, if choices have been made to show images of brands of climbing equipment, these choices are not inspired by sponsoring. So if I make a decision to show you a certain type of climbing equipment, for example, the only reason why I'm using that specific brand is because I have it lying around, or whether it was easy to find or something like that. Okay, during this webinar, I'm going to focus on 3 questions. The first question is, how strong is a dynamic climbing rope and why? And the second question is, how strong are carabiners and why? And please note the difference. Dynamic climbing rope is dynamic equipment. Carabiners are static equipment, so there's a difference between the two. And third, last but not least, how should this knowledge affect our climbing practices? In other words, how do we implement that knowledge to climb safely? We'll start with the first question, how strong is a dynamic climbing rope and why? And before I get started with that, I'm saying here no physics please, but we do have to include a little bit of physics to understand the concept of impact force. Impact force will measure in kilonewtons, and 1 kilonewton is 1000 newton. It's basically a unit of gravity, and 9.8 kilonewton equals about 1000 kilograms. Very often we make an assumption that actually 10 kilonewton is 1000 kilograms. That's just to make the calculation a little bit easier. Why is there a difference between impact force and weight? Well, because a weight is like a static measurement, and impact force can also be about the acceleration due to falling, etc., etc. So we need to have a unit to calculate this. But still, if you're hanging from a rope, of course you also exert a certain amount of force, even if you're not falling at that moment in time. So you can also measure that in kilonewtons. What we also need to agree upon is that holding a dead weight on a rope, that it requires less strength than arresting that same weight when it's dropped. So what I mean by this is that if you have, for example, 10 kilograms on a rope and you hang it from your hand, it will be okay perhaps to hold it with one hand. However, if you take the same 10 kilograms weight and you drop it from a certain height, you are probably going to need 2 hands to keep it from falling down, because you are dealing with the situation that there's a higher impact force. And this is also to illustrate that kilograms alone is not enough, because In both of these figures, both of these diagrams, we're talking about a weight of 10 kilograms, but there is a difference in impact force between the left and the right, because in the right situation we're dealing with acceleration due to a fall, and it means that the impact force is increased. Okay, more physics we don't have to do. Next up, let's have a look at types of dynamic climbing ropes. This is important because these types of ropes, they are used in different situations. I've added a couple of pictures here to show you what it's like. And the one that we are going to focus on today are single ropes. This example to the left. So you have a single rope to which you are attached, to which you climb. There's also double rope technique, which comes either in half rope, which is that middle picture over there, or in twin rope. And you see in the half rope situation that actually the rope is going through different pieces of protection, whereas with a twin rope situation everything is clipped double. Now there's specific situations in which these techniques can be applied. What is important to know is that your rope needs to be suitable for that kind of technique, of course. So normally what you tend to see is that if your rope has been constructed as a single rope, there will be a circle with a 1 on your rope, and if that's the only circle that's on there with a symbol, that means then that that rope is only meant to be used as a single rope, not as a double rope. That is the situation we're going to focus on, because in sports climbing, and that's after all about 95% of what we do on Curacao, we are normally using a single rope. I've got a little bit of a quiz for you, and of course you're not here with me, so I will have to ask you the question and just give you a little bit of time to try to figure out an answer to it. The question is, how strong must a climbing rope be? And think back, we're going to talk about kilonewtons, because it's about the impact force that needs to be stopped. There's a couple of options for you available there. 1.5 kilonewton, option 1. Option 2, 12 kilonewton. And option 3, 125 kilonewton. I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about this and to see if you can reach the answer yourself. Okay, I hope that you've settled onto an answer. Please keep in mind the number that you chose. So 1.5, 12 or 125. To answer this question, let's have a look at a real rope information card. This is a card which is normally delivered with a climbing rope that will tell you some information about it. Interesting information such as the diameter, for example, which in this case is 9.5 millimeters. More interestingly, however, you see there to the top of that table, there is an impact force. And you see over there that next to that impact force, there's two figures. To the right over there you have the norm, which is 12 kilonewtons or less, and in the middle column over there you see the rating of the rope itself, which is 7.5 kilonewton. Okay, so the norm is 12 kilonewton, the rating is 7.5 kilonewton. Think of converting that again to kilograms. So we're talking about a norm of 1200 kilograms and a rating of 750 kilograms. Okay, if you're now thinking, okay, what the hell, the norm is 12, but this rope is actually just 7.5, so it's lower than that. What the hell? The norm is 12, but the rope actually holds less. That might be a conclusion that you reach based upon this information. Now, what's important to understand is that to understand what's happening here with these ratings, we first need to review a little bit of information about static climbing equipment. So let's hold this for a moment, this thought about this 12 versus 7.5, and have a look for a moment at static climbing equipment. And static climbing equipment is basically everything which is not climbing rope. So slings, carabiners, static rope. And if we're talking about a fall scenario, and think of a fall scenario like what we did before, right? We said, we want to have a weight, and it's attached to a rope and we're dropping it, and then we have to arrest the fall. That's basically a fall scenario. What would happen in a fall scenario is that you have a certain rating for, in this case, let's assume for a moment this is a carabiner. A carabiner has the norm of 22 kilonewtons along its long axis. So that's the way that it should be used. So if I have a scenario where I have an impact force of 12 kilonewton, I'm going to expect that the gear actually holds because it's less than the norm. In the second case, where it's 21 kilonewton, that's pretty heavy, but the gear still holds it because it's less than 22. And if it goes way over, I've got case number 3 here where I have an impact force of 33 kilonewtons, then the gear would fail. Now what's important to understand about static climbing equipment is that the way that the force is applied through time is a little bit like this. So there's a moment that the weight is falling, and then at the end of the fall, when the rope or the carabiners become tight, suddenly there's a peak impact force which is really high. And that's something which is important to understand about static climbing equipment. So for a very long time there's nothing as far as impact force comes. Then suddenly that falling weight is arrested to, it has a certain falling speed, and the speed is reduced to 0 in a very, very small amount of time. And it means that we have a very high impact force. I'm going to show you a little video here for a moment, and I'm going to go and get back to you once I'm finished that. Okay, I hope that what you can see from this video is that in this case we're generating an impact force which is actually higher than the impact force that this gear can actually hold. It's going over the rating for it or very close to it, and you see that in such a situation the gear will fail. Now this is the way that it works for static climbing equipment. So you have a norm. Normally you would be expecting that when the impact force is less than the norm, the static climbing equipment will survive. If it's going to go over the norm, it's going to fail. Now let's switch for a moment to dynamic climbing equipment. And again, dynamic climbing equipment is normally dynamic climbing rope. There's also fall arresters. Those are also a form of dynamic climbing equipment, but they are a bit outside the scope of sports climbing. So I'm just going to focus on the rope, and specifically the single rope. What you can see over here is basically a car that is crashing into something solid. And what you can see there is just the moment as it's crashed into that block, you see that the front of the car is sort of crumbling. And that is something, of course, which has been an innovation in cars generally, which basically is a way to say, if a car crashes into something, how can we make sure that the person, the passenger inside, is not hurt? And the main innovation there was to make sure, of course, that by having crumpling zones and airbags and such, that your body within a car actually doesn't reach the 0 speed in a very short amount of time, but rather you are braked. You move forward and your impact is actually cushioned. Now this is the same thing that happens in dynamic climbing equipment. So instead of coming to a halt in a very short amount of time, the impact force is actually spread through time. So there is a sort of a breaking way, let's say, a time during which the speed of the fall is reduced to 0. And because that time is longer than what we had before with the static climbing equipment, it means that the maximum impact force is reduced. What that means in practice is that if you want to have a look at how hard a fall is or how high the impact force is of a fall, you should not just be looking at the height of a fall, because that is not sufficient. There's another factor that needs to be weighed as well, and that is the amount of rope that is available to catch it. And this is something that we use the fall factor for. The fall factor is basically a relation between two things: the amount of meters that somebody falls and the amount of meters of rope that is available to absorb the fall. And as the amount of rope that is available to absorb the fall grows, the fall factor is reduced. The less rope is available to absorb the fall, the higher the fall factor is. And to the right side of that picture there, you see a situation which is the practical maximum in any climbing situation. This is actually a situation that will only occur in a situation where you are doing a multi-pitch climb. What you can see to the picture to the right there is that somebody was climbing from a belay stance, and that person is actually falling down without clipping his first piece of protection. So what happens there is that if somebody climbed 2 meters above the belay stance and that person falls, then that person falls 4 meters. So there's 2 meters of rope available to cushion a fall of 4 meters. And this brings us to the maximum fall factor, which is a fall factor 2, which is possible in, let's say, multi-pitch rock climbing. If you're doing single pitch rock climbing, then the maximum fall factor would be about 1, because you would never fall beneath the belay stance, because remember, the belay stance is the ground, that's where the belayer is standing. So this practical scenario would not be happening there. To the left there, that's much more common actually, as you can see. Please note, by the way, that the falling distance is exactly the same between the left and the right pictures. It's both, in this case, 4 meters and a little bit of stretch. But at the left there, you can see that actually the falling distance of 4 meters is cushioned by 10 meters of rope that has been paid out. And that means that the fall factor is 0.4. Now, what does this mean practically? It means that the fall on the left side, even though it is an equal distance to the one that is on the right side, the fall on the left side will feel very soft for the climber, whereas the fall on the right side will feel very hard for the climber. So you might say that the impact force of the fall with a dynamic climbing rope should not just be measured in kilonewtons, it should also be measured in the fall factor. Alright, so dynamic climbing equipment, we are talking about climbing ropes. And again, the fall scenario in this case is, again, we're dropping a weight, but now what happens is slightly different, because as we look through time and the rope is capable of stretching, it means that basically the impact force is reduced to a maximum of 12 kilonewtons. So in the first situation here, of 4 meter fall on a 12 meter rope, that's what we saw before, that reduces, that results in a very low fall factor, 0.3, 4 divided by 12. And that means that the total impact force is very limited in this case. The second case scenario, an 8 meter fall on a 12 meter rope. That's a pretty heavy fall actually, but still it's just fall factor 0.7. And it means that we're dealing with a total impact force of 4 kilonewtons. And a technical scenario where we are at the maximum, we have a 10 meter fall on a 5 meter rope. That's when we have fall factor 2, and that would then be the maximum impact force of 12 kilonewton. It is, in other words, not possible practically to fall further on that amount of rope in a rock climbing situation. How then do you think do I come to the kilonewtons in cases 2 and 1? Well, simply by looking at the relationship between the fall factor and the impact force. If you see an impact force on a rope as a norm, or as a impact force which is a maximum, then normally that is a maximum for a fall factor 2 or something which is pretty close to that. And those are the falls that you don't want to have actually, because having an impact force of 12 kilonewtons onto the rope means that you also have an impact force of 12 kilonewton onto your body and onto the belayer, and that is actually a very uncomfortable fall. But cases 1 and even 2 a little bit are, falls which are not very heavy for the climber. Especially the first one is going to feel like a breeze because it's not really something that will be a problem. And how this works basically is because as we have more rope in the system, it means that the stretching action that absorbs the power of the impact force is actually spread out through time. And that is why the peak is not there. The peak that we saw before with the static climbing equipment, which was very high, it doesn't ever get to that level because the impact force is actually spread out over time. So in the end, climbing ropes, to answer the question how strong should a climbing rope be and why, we see a rating which according to the norm is a maximum of 12 kilonewton. And why is it that? Well, basically because we want to make sure that the climber remains healthy when he's falling. If the impact force would be higher than 12 kilonewton, it would be a problem because the body of the climber wouldn't be able to actually absorb that impact force. And many modern ropes, by the way, have a lower impact force, which basically means that in a very heavy fall, the impact force that comes onto the body of the climber is way less. And that is the way that we want to look at falls on dynamic climbing rope. So we shouldn't look at it in the way that we look at it from static climbing gear, in which it's just a matter of we have a certain norm. As long as we keep under the norm, it's not going to break. Do we go over the norm, then it is going to break. With climbing ropes, if you look at the impact force which the rope has been tested for, we're talking about the practical maximum that you can face in a climbing scenario. Okay. That was the first one. The second question is how strong are carabiners and why? And this is an interesting question because we've just talked about a rope. And basically it's important to understand that if the rope limits the impact force to a maximum of 12 kilonewtons, then why must the carabiner be able to hold 22? Because 22 is the official norm of the UIAA. Well, the question to this is to basically the pulley effect. And to understand the pulley effect is something which can actually help if you're trying to rescue a climber, for example. If you would be trying to pull somebody out of a route, let's say, or to help them to get through the crux of a route which is too hard for them. So normally what you would be having is that if somebody is hanging from a rope and that person is 100 kilograms, then you will need to actually apply the opposite force to make sure that that person doesn't fall down. But of course, if you're going to pull that person up, it means that you're basically trying to pull up 100 kilograms. If you use a pulley for that, what you will see is that you still have to pull on the rope and you'll have to exert quite a bit of force, but it's going to be less force than when you don't use a pulley. Normally the division is about 50-50, but we have to account for friction. So if we account for friction in the system, because the rope, as you see at that dot there to the right, it's being fixed to the rock and it goes through a pulley and then it goes up again. Because of the friction, we need to actually pull more than what the belay point is actually taking off the weight. And this is a system which can be very useful if you're trying to rescue somebody. This is an example of how that would work. So you see that in that photograph, somebody is actually installing a system of pulleys, which makes it easier basically to sort of get somebody to help them come up to the top of the route. Now, if the pulley effect works this way around, what then happens if we compare the pulley effect or apply it to a situation where we're dealing with elite climbing? So in a lead climbing scenario over here, remember that we discussed before that if the impact force of a rope has been set to a certain value, and we said 12 kilonewton is sort of the practical maximum, then what you will see is that on the other side, where the belayer is, I've put a picture of an ATC over there, then if a certain impact force is exerted by the climber because that person is falling, then on the other side there must be an opposing force to arrest that fall. And these two added together, that is basically what goes into the top of the belay chain where the top quick draw is. So that means that in this case, that quick draw is not getting that 12 kilonewton of the fall, no, it's getting the fall and the braking action both. So that means that we get 8 and 12 kilonewtons together, which is 20 kilonewtons. So just to refresh, here we have the maximum impact force of a climber who makes a leader fall. On the left side there we have the braking force of the belayer, which is also applied to the belay chain, and that together makes the 20 kilonewtons that needs to be taken care of at the top of the belay chain. And of course, you know, the 12 kilonewtons was a practical maximum in a full factor 2, and in that case, of course, you don't really have to pull the effect because there is no quick draw. But still, you know, if you clip close to the belay stance and you would fall, you would still end up with values which are sort of near to this impact force that I'm showing you over here. So you can see that, you know, these impact forces, they need to be a little bit like this. That is also why in the gear webinar I told you guys, you know, look out for situations where your carabiners are cross-loaded or loaded across an edge or are loaded in such a way that the gate will be opened of the carabiner. This is the reason why, because in a worst case scenario the carabiners, they do need to hold that 20 kilonewtons. The 8 kilonewtons for an opened gate or for loading it across its short axis is simply not enough to arrest the fall in this scenario. Okay, so now we know a little bit about how this works. How should that then affect our climbing practices? And first of all, let me show you a video again, because I need to clarify something about falling before we actually go ahead.
If you constantly find yourself checking the distances between the bolts or worrying about falling when you should be focusing on the climbing, then you will be failing to reach your potential by a considerable margin. You know in your head that falling's safe, so why does that primal fear still consume you every time you move above a bolt? Simple, because you've never tried to tame it. There are no quick fix, fancy mental training solutions. The only way to get happy with the idea of leader falls is to take them on a regular basis. If you are prepared to go through the initial discomfort, then leading will soon feel no different to top roping. Here's how to go about it. So don't jump in at the deep end. Start first of all with some bounces. And once you've done that, you can try going for something a little bit bigger. And then when you're really feeling confident, something a little bit bigger. And then the final stage, when you're really sure what's going on, is the worst case scenario.
Now, watching this video, I hope that you understand that if we are talking about falling in this scenario, we are talking about leader falls. Why? Because leader falls, those are the ones that really generate an impact force. If your belayer is attentive in a top rope situation, it is not really possible for a big impact force to occur. And again, you know, paying attention during the belay is something which is simply a vital part of your safety. So, thinking about leader falls then, how should this knowledge that we've just discussed, how should it affect our climbing practices? Well, first of all, you want to try to avoid situations where you can free fall without the dynamic climbing rope in the chain. And just to give you an example of that, think back of that first movie that I showed you about the slings that were breaking. That's the situation that we want to avoid, but that is also the situation that might occur when we are actually falling off static gear, like for example slings or static rope or carabiners. So you want to avoid the situation where you can free fall without a dynamic climbing rope in the chain. I know that many people have a tendency to fix themselves with a lifeline to a belay stance, and that is all perfectly fine as long as you're hanging from it. But as soon as you try to climb above your belay stance or you're going to stand away from it, beware of the risk. You know, if there's going to be the potential of a fall, it is better actually to use the dynamic rope. So you don't have to fall far on the sling to make it fail. That's what we saw in the first video. And if it doesn't fail, the impact force is still such that you risk serious injury. So that's important to realize. You know, if a sling is going to break at 22 kilonewtons and you would fall and it would be a fall of 20 kilonewtons, then, you know, your sling might still hold it, but it's way above the 12 kilonewtons that we discussed. That is the maximum that your body can bear. So you simply don't want to fall on the sling. It's, however, also important to realize, of course, that the tests that I showed you are in a laboratory situation. If you are on a belay stance somewhere on the side of a rock, then normally, of course, you won't really free fall, but you will slip and slide. So you don't get the same kind of situation there. And also your body absorbs a little bit of impact force as well. What I want to say with this is that if you're clipping into the belay stance prior to, for example, rappelling, your lifeline might not be tight, but it might not directly be a problem. But it is a risk that you need to be aware of. For example, standing with a long sling above your belay stance while you are fixed to it is really not a good idea, because then you have real fall potential and it might make your gear fail. It might also mean that you get a big injury simply because the impact force is too much. So that is one thing. And in this situation, I think it's good to note that nowadays there are also lifeline systems which use dynamic rope. In such a situation, you are a little bit more flexible, let's say, because then, you know, if you stand a little bit away from your belay stance or you stand a little bit above it, you know, you won't be in so much of trouble if you fall, simply because the rope is dynamic. Another thing which is important to consider is that all the rope that has been paid out must be available to soften the fall. That's what we call the real fall factor. Remember that before we said if you are in a lead climbing scenario, I've got a guy and a girl here climbing together. The girl is lead climbing and she's clipped 3 bolts. She's standing above her last bolt. If she falls down, you can see that all the rope that is available can actually help to cushion the fall. But what if this same person is climbing a route in which the belay points for some reason or the bolts have been spaced apart and you get this zigzag pattern? What you then get is basically that you get friction from the rope within the quick draws. This will, by the way, also make it very hard for this guy to actually climb because he has to pull up the rope. But if he falls, it's very important to consider that because of the friction, it's the top part of the rope that's going to get the maximum impact force, while the rope which goes from the belayer to the first bolt, for example, is almost going to be like loaded to nothing. And why is this important? Well, because this top part of the rope, if that is the main piece of the rope that is actually being loaded, you have to remember then that the amount of rope which is available to cushion a certain falling distance is actually less than it seems. It is less than the amount of rope that has been paid out. How to deal with this practically? Try to avoid this situation. In other words, either extend your pieces of protection, to avoid this zigzag pattern, or use a double rope if you need to climb in this scenario. If you use a double rope, specifically a half rope, you would be able to clip one rope into the left pieces of protection and another rope into the pieces of protection which are to the right. It is, by the way, also a way to say if you are in a situation where you can't finish a route and you are very much tempted to actually climb left or right to go into another route, consider whether this is actually a good idea, because you risk running into a situation like this. Then we're going to go to number 3. When belaying a lead climber and she falls, try to give a soft catch. What I mean by this is, if you have a lead climber and the lead climber is telling you that he's going to fall, if you are an inexperienced climber, you might be inclined to take in the rope to block basically. This is actually not a good idea, because what you are then doing is that you're making the fall very hard for the climber. Trying to give a soft catch is basically a way to move with the fall to make sure that you get basically a longer distance of rope which is available to then break the fall. So when a fall is occurring, be prepared to move with the fall. So in other words, stand back a little bit from the wall, and then when the fall occurs, walk a little bit forward to cushion it. That is one way to make the belay a little bit dynamic. That's also what we call this. Dynamic belaying is about making sure that the impact force is actually limited. If you don't have room to walk around, what you can also do is crouch and jump up when the fall occurs, or simply stand up when the fall occurs. Sometimes this is enough. And with these approaches, of course, what we also need to consider is what is the difference in weight. If you are heavier than your lead climber, these things about moving with the fall when it occurs becomes very important to limit the impact force. However, if you are way lighter than your climber, then it is basically, you can do these things, but the fall is going to be a dynamic one no matter what. In other words, what you want to do is you want to stand close to the wall, not get too much distance. You don't have to crouch and jump when the fall occurs, because you are going to be pulled up automatically because of the weight difference. Another way to do this is to be prepared to let some rope slip through the belay device as the climber falls. This is something that requires practice and of course a suitable belaying device. And nowadays with the advent of the semi-automatic blocking devices, it becomes harder to do this. But with an ATC or a figure of 8, this is something that you can do if you practice it first, of course. Soft catches do mean longer falls, and that also means that you have to be intelligent about it. Because a soft catch is a perfect idea if the climber is high up from the ground. But if the climber is close to the ground, then of course you want to watch out. Because if there's a risk of a ground fall, that is something that you want to avoid. So if the climber has just clipped the first bolt, for example, you're not going to try to give a soft catch, because in that situation, because the climber is still close to the ground, there is a real risk of injury because the climber simply falls into the ground. I think it's a good idea to have a look at a couple of situations when there is a risk of a ground fall, which are typically situations where you are at risk of a ground fall. Well, this is for example the case when you are climbing and you haven't reached the first bolt yet. Now normally of course the first bolt of a route is not too high up, but still, when you have not clipped any piece of protection, there's a risk of a ground fall. What is normally also a dangerous situation is once you've clipped the first bolt and you're going to the second bolt. Here we have a situation in this second picture where actually the last bolt was on 2 meters and the next one is actually on 4 meters. That means that, there's a good chance that actually this climber will fall to the ground if she slips there. Just before the third bolt, we also get a situation like this. And of course, keep in mind, it is also very much dependent on the spacing of the bolts, how close they are together, how big this risk actually is. And some bolters will keep this in mind and, for example, try to make sure that, for example, the second bolt is pretty close actually to the first bolt. Or that the first bolt is high up, but it is because it is easier ground to actually reach that point. In this case, rope length is 7 meters, the last bolt was at 4 meters, so there is sort of also there a risk of a ground fall. Then after the third bolt, normally it stops. You don't have too much of a risk of a ground fall anymore, unless, of course, the bolts are really spaced. And this is something you need to consider. It's not just like my climber is 7 meters or higher up from the ground, so I don't have to worry about this anymore. No, it is also, of course, about what the climber does after that, because basically it is dependent on the distance between the bolts. Over here you can see, that last bolt there was at 7 meters, and now this person is 12 meters up. If that person slips over there, there's a real risk of ground fall. Now, I can hear you thinking, probably, that if you do a little bit of math, you're probably thinking, why are these situations a risk of a ground fall? Because you might be thinking, for example, about that third picture coming from the left, where it says just before the third bolt. It says, you know, there's a rope length of 7 meters and the last bolt was at 4 meters. So this lady is going to fall 3 meters to the bolt and then 3 meters down again. And with 3 meters, if that second bolt is 4 meters up from the ground, with that 3 meters of fall, that person is not going to land on the ground, right? Because if you take a falling distance of 6 meters and you are 7 meters from the ground, then 7 minus 6 is still 1 meter from the ground, right? Well, that's not entirely true. Think again. Why? Because normally people tend to think that what determines how far you fall when you make a leader fall is primarily determined by the height that you climbed above your last piece of protection. And then the idea is, of course, if you're 2 meters above your last piece of protection, then what you will fall is you will fall 2 meters down and yet another 2 meters, because that's the amount of rope that has been paid out. So in other words, you can fall twice the height that you climbed above your last piece of gear. I'm afraid that this is not actually true. Why? Because there is actually more in the system that will be absorbed before actually you come to a halt. And first of all, there's the amount of slack, for example. There is slack that has been paid out to enable free movement of the climber. Remember that we always say, you don't want to give a tight rope to a lead climber because you risk pulling that person out of the rock. But this slack, of course, will be consumed when somebody falls down, so it adds to the falling distance. But slack is not just paid out to enable free movement, it is also paid out to deal with inattention. And let me explain what I mean by this. Slack paid out to deal with inattention is slack that is dealt out because you are thinking, I cannot always predict when somebody is going to take a high step and is going to actually ask for rope to be paid out. So normally you have slack to deal with free movement, but you're also giving a little bit extra just to make sure that you don't have to react within a millisecond of the movement of the climber. So that's also a little bit of slack that you pay out. So there's more, and that slack that all goes into the falling distance. Another thing that goes into the falling distance is rope stretch. So when the rope becomes tight, let's say, it's going to stretch and that's going to add to the falling distance as well. If the impact force is high enough, the belayer will also be forced to move. If the belayer is standing back from the wall a little bit, and there comes quite a leader fall with quite a big impact force, then the belayer is going to be pulled forward, and that's also going to add to the falling distance. And then if you're dealing with a really heavy fall, you're also going to deal with the rope slipping through the belay device, especially if you're using a tuber or a figure of 8, for example. With an auto black, of course, that you have a little bit less. And if the difference in weight is really big, then the belayer movement might not only be forward to the wall, but also up, because the climber is simply pulling the belayer up because of the impact force. So what I want to say with this is that this rule where we said, what you fall with a leader fall is twice the height that you climb above your last piece of gear, that's not true. Replace this with another one. In reality, what you fall as a distance is 3 to 4 times the height that you climb above your last piece of gear, depending on the situation and the weight ratio between you and your belayer. And that's important to realize as well, because this affects whether you will actually be coming onto the ground or not when a leader fall occurs. Last point is, be the attentive belayer. That is also something that we need to take from this. Who is wary of the differences in weight between the climber and the belayer. And, don't make an assumption there. If you see somebody, they might not look that heavy, but perhaps they are. Or it's the other way around. They are way lighter than you think. This needs to affect your belaying as well, of course. If your climber is really way heavier than you want to consider that you will be actually pulled up if you get an impact force from a leader fall. The other way around, if the climber is really lighter than the belayer, you want to make sure that you are poised to move with the fall to make it a little bit of a soft catch. The attentive belayer is also somebody who will ask the lead climber for his personal preference for how tight the rope should be. Some people like a tight belay, some people like a loose belay. But of course, apart from this, you also have to consider the risk of a ground fall. The attentive belayer is also the person who before the first bolt makes sure that there is sufficient slack to clip the first bolt and guides the rope away from the movement of the climber to make sure that the rope doesn't end up between his legs and so he trips over it. Spots the lead climber, of course, in the case that the weight difference is not too big, but always keep in mind, spotting of course is about guiding the fall. It's not actually about catching somebody, it's just about making sure that you don't fall on the ground head first. And number 3, the attentive belayer is also the person who, when the first bolt is clipped, immediately is ready to start belaying. So the moment that the first bolt is clipped, that at that moment in time, the belayer is already belaying the climber, so that person is safe. And the attentive belayer is also the person who, after the first bolt, positions him or herself well. So if there is a big weight difference, make sure that you don't stand back too far. If the weight difference is in favor of the belayer, in other words, the belayer is way heavier than the climber, make sure that there is a little bit of space for movement so that you can give a soft catch. And of course, who also gives a relaxed belay and keeps observing the lead climber. You know, giving a belay is not about being tense, but it's about being relaxed while at the same time keeping your attention with the lead climber. And of course, you know, who also recognizes critical situations with ground fall potential, gets ready and acts. For example, if you are belaying your lead climber and suddenly you see that they've missed a bolt, and you know that if that person climbs on actually to the next piece of protection, then just before that piece of protection he will get into a danger zone because there's a risk of a ground fall without even realizing it. So you want to call out, you know, you forgot a bolt, please clip it. And last but not least, you know, whose attention is with the lead climber always. That's of course the vital thing as well. And normally this would of course be the end of a webinar where we get to questions. You guys are with me, not with me right now, so I can't really give you the opportunity to ask your questions. If you have questions, however, you know how to contact me if it's about the contents of this video or any of the other stuff that we talked about. Thank you for your attention and goodbye.